How do I find a new job? How can I make a career change? And the biggest question of all, can I really find a career that I love? Hey, my name is Jen Smith, and I believe career success doesn't have to be at the expense of living a radiantly happy and healthy lifestyle. As a former HR leader and recruiter turned career coach, I get what companies are looking for when hiring top talent. What that means for you is an unmatched combination of insider knowledge and the best kept secrets about making heart-based career changes and navigating the ups and downs of job searching in today's world of work. Whether you're a recent graduate navigating the job market for the first time or a seasoned professional ready for a career change, this show is for you. So grab your coffee or your kombucha, pull up a seat, and get ready to be challenged and inspired to move beyond your self-doubt and take the right next steps towards landing a career you love. Because you deserve a long, radiantly happy and healthy career. This is the Flourish Careers podcast. Hello, and welcome back to the Flourish Careers podcast. I'm Jen Smith, your host, and today I'm thrilled to be here for another installment of Flourishing Together, a monthly segment dedicated to curated conversations with industry insiders, sharing wisdom and strategies for improving your work and well-being. I'm delighted to introduce you to Vicki Bradley, the founder of Vicki Bradley and Company and Will Empowered, which stands for Women in Leadership Empowered. Her focus is on supporting leaders to become more conscious by expressing their bold voices, owning their power skills, and better harmonizing their feminine and masculine attributes as leaders, which I'm really excited to talk more about today. In addition, Vicki is currently completing her PhD, which is such a huge accomplishment, with a focus on power dynamics and their impact on women. Vicki is a seasoned executive with over 25 years of experience in the retail industry C-suite, leading iconic brands such as the Bombay Furniture Company, where she was president for 9 of those years. And in her free time, Vicki likes to travel and read and connect with people and spend time with her kids. And fun fact, I had to add this in there, Vicki and I live in different countries, although we're only about an hour and a half away from each other, which is just fun. So even though we're in different countries, we're practically neighbors.
We are.
Vicki, it's so good to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for inviting me on your show.
So today we're going to talk about conscious leadership, which based on my ongoing conversations with job seekers, this is so needed in today's working world. So to kick us off, do you mind sharing a little bit more about what you mean by conscious leadership and maybe how that's different from traditional leadership approaches?
Yeah, absolutely. So conscious leadership is, one of my favorite ways that I work with clients. And mostly that stems from my own experiences, having led a number of different organizations. But it's really about recognizing how are we showing up when things are going great? And how are we showing up when we get stressed? Because there's big differences there, right? And so what I work with clients on is helping them understand they have a choice, helping them understand what are their default tendencies. Are you, just as an example, are you falling into victim mode where you might feel powerless? Doesn't mean you're a victim, but when you get stressed, you might start to feel like I have no power or fear or doubt. All of those things that start playing in our heads come about. So for me, conscious leadership is really about being aware of how you're showing up. Are you reacting to situations or are you consciously responding?
That is huge. I love how you recommend it, first the self-awareness piece and just recognizing how you're showing up in different situations, and the responding versus reacting. I feel like there are so many leaders without even recognizing it. They just have these knee-jerk reactions to things, and they don't even realize, I call them like tornadoes. Like they don't even realize the damage that they're leaving behind them as they're this like tornado going through a stressful situation. Yeah. And that impact, especially depending on the level of leader, I mean, that impact can have multiple Huge. Layers, you know? Yeah. So just, kind of pausing and recognizing and having that self-awareness is a really big deal, especially today too. Now that I think about it, there's so many ups and downs with the economy and, just social activities that are going on, just so much up and down, and reacting and responding as a leader is really important, consciously, doing that consciously.
And it's not, sorry, just if I can expand on that for 1 second, Jen, it's not easy because people go, yeah, of course I understand, whether I'm reacting. And most of the time, to your point, we do not even know that we're doing it. But as you practice, build muscle in that, it's important to understand you have a choice, right? And how many times do you hear leaders saying, oh, I didn't have a choice? Because there's so many complexities that are coming at us as leaders all the time. And so you do have to slow that autopilot down and just react to a place of, okay, I have a choice here. How do I want to best show up so the ripple effect is more positive than negative?
Yes. And having, to me, some of that comes with being mindful about how your team is going to respond to it. So it's knowing your team and knowing how, depending on the layers, like how many people are under you as a leader and how they're going to respond, and knowing, having an understanding of each of those individuals, and sometimes even involving them. Sometimes as leaders, we think that we have to take it all on ourselves and it's all on our shoulders. But I found through the years that even involving the team with hard things can be a completely different outcome than just having some kind of knee-jerk reaction as well. So
100%, because they feel valued, they feel heard, you build their confidence, right? And we're all in this together.
Exactly.
Right? We're not sitting on an island by ourselves as leaders. And oftentimes there is that mindset that, oh, I can't tell them or I can't include them. And so it's how do you help bring them along the journey with you? And organizations and leaders who do that well usually are way more successful because they include people. They make people feel valuable, and we all want to feel like we belong, right? And so there's ways to do that to really be conscious and help individuals also, so that when they're working with their teams or they're working with customers, they're doing the same thing, right? So there is this huge ripple effect. Yeah.
Yes, I agree with you. Now, when you talk about, so something that really stood out to me was you talking about feminine and masculine attributes as leaders. So what does that mean? And can you share some examples?
Of course. Yeah, I know. People kind of look at me like, what? You got two heads, Vicki. So this is really interesting. So when I was at Bombay, I got really, really sick, and it came out of nowhere. And I was like, I'm this thriving, 30-some-year-old, late 30s. I'm, running Canada and the US for a while. And then all of a sudden I get super sick. And I was like, okay, how am I not well? I truly didn't understand where this came from. Anyway, I share that because I ended up having to go on this journey of figuring out what the heck was wrong with me. And I met someone in my wellness journey who said to me, wow, Vicki, you spend a lot of time in masculine energy. And I was like, what does that even mean? And she said, well, we all have both masculine and feminine energy within us. And as I started to unpack that, Jen, what I started to realize is, as a leader, I was oftentimes the only female in the room. I put on this armor to survive. And I put on these masks of being in battle, right? And so that's a very heavy masculine attribute, right? Men are protectors, they're hunters. They think they have to come across as being very, very strong. And so I started taking on more of those attributes in order to survive as a leader.
Mm-hmm.
And I see this often in women. In my particular situation, because I spent so much time there and I was physically, emotionally, mentally out of alignment with both my femininity and my masculinity, because we all have both, it took a physical toll on me. And that, I think, was a big part of why I got sick, because I was not in alignment with who I am as a person, but also as a leader. And so that created a lot of curiosity in me, is what am I observing with leaders? Because I work with a lot of executives. I also work with a lot of emerging leaders. And so I start to look at, how are they showing up? What masks are we putting on when we go into conversations or when we're navigating management meetings or boardroom tables? How are we going about that? And what is our bodies telling us? And so for both men and women, it's super important to start to look at, how do I harmonize both? Right? Because you need both. You need the femininity, but you also need the masculinity. And I think, a bit of the feminine movement that we've been on, we've sort of been pushing away the masculine, and it's not about that. It's how do you harmonize them? So hopefully that, answers the question. But I know for me personally, that was a big part of my own healing as to, why was I squashing my feminine side?
Yes.
How do I bring that back to being me so that I am in alignment with who I am as a human being? And how do I use that to my advantage as I navigate life? Right? I don't have to be this warrior who's always ready to fight. And how that feminine is so important in so many of the decisions we make, because we tend to look at things more long-term, more broadly, where our masculine tendency is short-term thinking, right?
Yes.
Where how do we catch the meal today versus how do we feed, how do we harvest, how do we feed our families for a long time, right? So that harmonization becomes super, super important.
Yes, I talk with a lot of people about alignment in careers, and I love helping people find alignment from more of a career planning perspective. But I talk a lot about when you're in a role and it doesn't feel like a fit, how that can provide a lot of wear and tear on your body, which you experienced, I've experienced it. And I think that is true, because a lot of times our corporate settings are like the battlefield. It's that fight or flight kind of thing. And especially if you feel like you have to prove yourself, being the only woman in a room full of men, which I've been there too. My early career, I was in manufacturing. I was one of the only women, and it's a lot different. And you kind of have to pretend a little bit to fit in, or feel like you have to pretend to fit in. And that can take a lot of energy, and that really can drain the energy out of you, which over time leads to stress and potentially eventually sickness, which you experienced and I've experienced it. And so I love that you're able to take that experience and dig into it and then help others not get to the point where they're sick. And so just out of curiosity, so when I think of masculine and feminine, I kind of think of energies, like maybe more empathy and compassion from a feminine perspective, and maybe a little more decisiveness or assertiveness from a masculine perspective. How do you help people? I guess like it's probably a little bit around some self-awareness, but then how do you help people harmonize those or bring those together?
Yeah, part of it goes back to when we just first started talking about understanding what your default tendencies are. Right? So when you have a conscious choice, so that's one way that I work with clients, is helping them see that they have 7 possible choices of how they could respond to any situation. Right? And so it's part of it is moving from reactionary to being responsive. And so looking at things holistically, like what serves this particular situation the best. Sometimes it might be having more of that masculine energy. Maybe that is what you need to have in that given moment based on that situation. But it is pausing and looking at it longer term, right? Like what would actually serve me personally, but also what serves the situation and all of those involved for the longer run. So I think that's part of it. It's also recognizing when you become more conscious, it impacts your decision making, right? Like you definitely are more clear because you can see things more broadly. And so you and I both know too, when we've reacted, we've had to go back and play cleanup, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because maybe we didn't make a great decision. And so when you're highly conscious of that, then your clarity around how you're engaging and how you're deciding to do things is much more long-term focused.
Yes. The word adaptable comes to mind here, but it's not, it's being adaptable and agile, but also being authentic. So it's recognizing where you have to adapt and be agile, but not to the extent that it's going to cause you to be someone that you're not. So
Yeah,
adapting
exactly.
to the situation, to the people involved, but not so much to the point where it's like, oh, I'm doing this all the time and it's causing me to not be my authentic leader that I want to be and bring to the table every day. So there's got to be some type of, I guess, balance in there. But I think, again, it goes back to that recognition and that self-awareness about what you bring to the table and how you respond and or react to each situation. So very
Exactly.
interesting. Yeah, very
Yeah.
interesting. I'm trying to think, and maybe you can help with an example. So do you have an example of a leader that you worked for that had this conscious leadership and how that differed from maybe somebody that wasn't? I don't know if you could
Yeah.
share an example from that
Oh,
perspective.
yeah, absolutely. Probably one of my, I would say one of the individuals that had the biggest impact on my own growth as a leader. When I came to Canada, I worked for him, and he was very, I would say, very holistic in his approach. And he himself was very much in alignment with both masculine and feminine and highly inclusive, right? Like he included me in everything and also pushed me where like things I never had exposure to. Example, when I went to work for him, I had always been very much focused on the sales operations side. And when I started working for him, he started pushing me into being, very in tuned with the buying side of the business, the marketing side of the business. And at first I was like, yes, I understand how customers think and how they shop. And he was like, exactly. So how do you take those skills and incorporate it into? And he was very much of I would say an inquirer when he was leading and coaching teams. Whereas the opposite of that is working for a leader who is very tell. And I remember we were in a session with a consulting group. They had come in and there were 12 executives. And the CEO was like, we can't work together. Like, we need to figure out how to work together. So he hired this consulting firm. And he was very much a doer, right? And so if you think about the assessments where it classifies you as a red, blue, yellow, green,
Mm-hmm.
right? Red is very task focused. And so we went through this assessment and I'll never forget the consultant says, wow, it's really interesting. So you have 12 executives and you're a high red, and all but 2 of your executives that you've hired are all red. So they were taskmasters, right? Myself and one other individual were very much green. So we were about the people and how did the decisions we're making impact the masses, whether it be our employees or our customers. And through this conversation, the CEO said to him, he goes, oh, that's really interesting. And then he put his head down and he goes, okay, let's get back to the task we were talking about. And I was like, oh my God, we just spent like $500,000 for this guy to tell us this is not working. But he was that CEO, great guy, right?
Of
But
course.
so polar opposite of what I was accustomed to, which was somebody who had a significant impact. And by the way, I only worked with that one leader for 2 years, and he had the biggest impact on my career of any leader that I have worked with. Like amazing, right? But very in tuned to even bringing out the best in people, right? So, and that makes such a difference. I don't know if that answered the
Oh,
question, Jen.
yeah.
That's an example of somebody who was highly conscious to somebody who was Zero.
Yes. And I love your example because that contrast, I think everyone can relate to when we've worked with, even the visionaries and the inclusive leaders versus the ones that are just like, get it done. Here's your list for the day. Go do it. Don't care how you get it done. There's such a difference there. And it's so interesting that you shared about the assessment. So it brings me back. I'm going to share a quick story too here of a time where I was a HR leader supporting a sales organization, and we did the DISC assessment together.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a huge organization, and there was probably maybe like 30 or 40 leaders that did the DISC assessment together. And we put up a chart in the room. And majority of folks in the room were this high D&I. So it's the dominance and the very people-oriented and, individual focused. And there was me and one other person that was more on like the teamwork side and the dominance. So, but it was very eye-opening to see the chart. And then people, oh, poor Jen, you're down there by yourself. I'm like, no. It's good. This is good to have, multiple different types of people.
Of course. It's super important.
It's really important, but it also made me realize, very interestingly enough, that supporting a sales organization wasn't a perfect fit for me at that time in my career. And so it was a really interesting dynamic from both a leadership perspective, a teamwork perspective, an individual development, growing perspective. So there was a lot that came out of that. And I think to your point, just getting people together and recognizing differences and where people are coming from actually can bring a lot to the table from a leadership perspective and a teamwork perspective. So
100%. Like so important what you just described, because if everybody's the same, then nobody is able to provide a different perspective.
Right.
Right. And when you have that, because diversity is not just diversity with gender or religion or sex, or it's also about diversity of thought, right?
Yes.
And how and what we contribute to different situations. So I love that. And I mean, there's some companies who do a great job now when they're actually bringing executives on, of putting them through assessments to see how do they fit in that organization. Like as a leader, I always look for people who weren't like me.
Same.
Right? So it's like, how do you, because you're balancing,
yes.
Right? You're always balancing because your people that you lead, your customers, they don't all think like you, right? So how do you cover all aspects and have a much broader perspective on even the decisions you're making?
I couldn't agree more. And I have to tell you, so one of my roles in HR was focusing in talent acquisition. And I tried to instill that into leaders so many times about, hey, let's look at the skills and experiences of your whole team and figure out where the gap is. We don't need more of the same. We don't need somebody that has been there, done that, that's going to come in here in 6 months, be bored. Like, let's have somebody that brings a different perspective, that maybe hasn't had the exact experiences, that's going to grow into the role and really add value in a different mindset, different perspectives and experiences to this team. And some leaders get it, some don't. Sometimes it can be a tricky sell, which is probably why you do the work that you do, which we're super grateful for.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's so true. Like I was talking to a client this week, and she has a new leader that has come on, and both of them are very, very senior, and they're trying to figure out what their roles are, right? Together and separately. And it creates a lot of unrest because our natural tendency is to defend our territory, right? And so part of that is, how do we take the best, to your point, how do we take the best of both of you and find that common ground so that collectively we can really meet the objectives that we're trying to meet. Otherwise, we're spending so much time internally and externally fighting with each other that we're not able to take the organization and the people that we're leading to the next level or to meet the objectives that we're trying to meet.
Yeah, and that's really what it's about. When it comes down to it, we're all here to make a buck,
It is that simple.
when personalities and egos and all these things get involved, sometimes having a very direct conversation about something like that can be, it can be tricky. And so, there's lots of folks that are good at navigating those. And I love when leaders are at least open to listening to each other, to kind of break those barriers down and put a plan together for the greater good. And working in HR for so many years, I feel like a lot of it comes down to communication is, hey, let's just make sure we're talking off the same sheet of music. Let's sit down and just talk this out and figure this out, which, it sounds simple, but easier said than done, as we know.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So you mentioned, we just kind of talked about the bottom line here. So I feel like a lot of leaders feel pressure around delivering short-term results and long-term well-being for an organization. So how do conscious leaders do that? Do you have any ideas or strategies or stories to share around that?
Yeah, and it is a balancing act for sure. I mean, from a societal perspective, we have created systems that incentivize on the short term.
Yes, exactly.
Right? And so, there's a lot of companies now that they do short-term and long-term incentives, or people get shares in an organization, which to me, that is super important because it forces leaders to start to look at the long game.
Yes.
Right. And so that part of it is how we set up our systems. But as leaders, it's not an easy job.
Right.
There's no question. Right. But it is a balancing act all the time. Right. If I do X, what is that potential outcome? Right. If I do Y, what is that potential outcome? What is the impact to the organization? And I'll go back to keeping it in simplistic terms is how are you impacting an organization to move it forward, right? And so it is that look at, what are the things we're doing right now that are having a positive impact? What are the things that we're not doing well that we need to change in order? Because if you're looking at it consistently, measuring it consistently, talking about it, like so many times, Jen, I'm in organizations and I'll say, okay, talk to me about what your strategy is this year. And the super, super senior will say, oh, it's da, 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 da. And then when I start talking to the emerging leaders and the people who are actually executing, they're like, I don't really know what we're supposed to be doing.
Disconnected.
Yeah. So there's this communication gap that happens. And so when leaders can stop the noise of the 75 things to do, narrow it down, what is our 3 to 5? That can help an organization like hyper focus. As you master the 3 to 5, then you can move on and add, 2 or 3 more. But constantly communicating that and making sure that people are always top of mind. Does this fit with what our end objective is? I think that's one of the best ways to, harmonize things, to keep people engaged and part of that moving the organization forward.
Ruthless prioritization comes to mind. I have this conversation with so many people. There's so much to get done. We've got all these things we've got to do. And as leaders, you have to prioritize. Sometimes I even work with either emerging or mid-level managers that are just so flustered because there's a gazillion priorities coming from above and they just can't even keep their head above water. And that's where I always go back to, you've got to go to your leaders and figure out what the top 3 priorities are right now. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to keep up. And I think it really frustrates. And that's probably why a lot of organizations see this turnover, because people at that level get super frustrated because they can't. They want to achieve. No one wakes up and says, I want to do something terrible today, or I want to have a bad day. People want to achieve, they want to do a good job, but they need to know what those priorities are and how to, And the other thing that comes to mind as you're talking about this and kind of this balance of people and profit and, this harmony is sometimes you have to be courageous as a leader and you have to make hard decisions. But I also think that there are ways to creatively support your people while you're doing that. So I think of layoffs. So that's a very difficult thing to manage as a leader. And to make that decision is never done lightly. And also, I think of if there's a conscious leader that's working to balance the short term and the long term, maybe there's a way to redeploy folks so you don't have to just let them go. Could we talk with them and say, hey, we've got a situation. Are there any other jobs that you might want to do? Like maybe we need more people in sales and less people behind the scenes, whatever that is, but be creative and thoughtful about it and involve your team, even in those hard decisions. And it can have such a better outcome versus these organizations that I'm hearing about that are laying people off over email, like surprising them with an email at 8:00 in the morning, that you don't have a job anymore. To me, that is completely unconscious, and it happens.
Not human.
It's not, it's not, and it happens a lot. And it's sad, when people don't think about the long term. So,
well, and so as you were saying that, I'll share an example with you. I think there is this tendency, it goes back to the knee-jerk reacting, right? So there's this theme. It's not that, executives from all the big top 100 are calling each other saying, hey, we're laying off all these people. But there is this unsaid vibe that goes through business that, I'll just make up names. Not that this is happening, but I'm making up names. Microsoft decides they're going to lay off 10,000 people. And then Salesforce hears this and then they go, oh, well, maybe we should be proactive. We're going to lay off, right? Mm-hmm. Or it could be the banks, right? Like it doesn't matter. But what we do then is we go through this mechanical exercise that says, oh, okay, if we have to cut 10,000 people, where's the least productive, right? Who are the people that were borderlining already? That's the ones we're going to cut. Instead of challenging that.
Right.
So I'll give you an example for my own personal. So when I was running Bombay, of course, 9/11 happened. And I remember the parent company came to me and they said, Vicki, you need to cut 16 people out of the corporate office. And I was like, what? No, I'm not cutting 16 people out. And they're like, we all have to buckle down. There's people being cut, blah, 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 blah. So I said, okay, what are the dollars that you need? And they gave me the dollar figure. So instead of cutting people, I huddled my executive team and I said, okay, we have to cut $500,000 as an example. Where are we going to cut that? And of course, everybody at first is like, oh, no, we can't cut anything because we all are territorial, right? And I said, okay, the other option is we cut 16 people. And then everybody was like, oh. So you include your people to your point earlier, Jen. And so I started challenging them on processes. What are we doing that we're spending a lot of money on that is not adding value? Is there a different way for us to, provide this information in a more cost-effective way? The end result was we ended up giving back more money than what we were actually asked to share. And we didn't cut any people.
Amazing.
Right? Because we got creative, to your point. We took a step back and said, okay, hang on a second. How do we do this without losing our people? And that's what we did. Right. And so as leaders, we have to be the ones to challenge the status quo or challenge the trend that's happening and look at different ways. Maybe there was 2 or 3 people that needed to be cut, but to me, it was better to look at what are we doing that is really not adding value or that we might be able to do differently and save that same amount of money. So that's just an example.
This example is conscious leadership. So everyone that's listening, that is a great example of conscious leadership. And in my mind, what we need so much more of in this world today. So thank you for sharing that example. I know it can be a little vulnerable to share stories like that, but man, I'm so glad you stood up and got your team involved and ended up giving back more, which is amazing. And, there's nothing that the organization can say about that other than thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I love this. Well, as we kind of come to a close, Vicki, I love asking folks their flourishing favorite. So a book or a podcast or some resource that has a significant impact on your career that you'd love to share with listeners.
Wow, there's so many because I am an avid reader, and especially because I'm doing my PhD, I read a lot of stuff now, more than ever. But there's two that really stand out to me, and they hit two different spectrums. So from a leadership perspective, I would encourage anybody who is leading teams to actually read Red Teaming. And this is a phenomenal book. It's how the military actually helps to train their special forces. But the principles are so incredible in supporting how we lead, how we bring teams together, how we get teams to engage collaboratively, get rid of the egos, people.
Yes.
and if your life depends on it, how would you work with your teammates, right?
Good one.
So it's a phenomenal read.
Yes.
The second one that I personally love and so interesting, Jen, this sat on my bookshelf for probably 20 years, and I'm not kidding you.
Oh my gosh.
I never read it. And then one day it was one of those books that like kept jumping, right? It's jumping off the shelf at me. And I'm like, okay, well, clearly it's time for me to read it. But it's called A Return to Love by Marianne Williamson. And it is a inner journey of how you want to lead your life, basically. But she articulates it beautifully, and it helps you to start to understand that the world is bigger than you.
Yes.
Right. And so that return to love is really about, again, how we show up in the world. How do we want people to see us and talk about us? Because we're being that leader. So two different spectrums, both incredible books, which I would highly, highly recommend.
Amazing. These are two books that I have not heard of yet. So I'm super excited to dig in. And I love the differences, like the military view on leadership and then the maybe more feminine side of returning to love and living your life in a very authentic way, it sounds like. So different perspectives. They might be really interesting to read one right after the other too. So I might give that a shot. I really appreciate you sharing those, Vicki. This has been so much fun talking with you. And conscious leadership is a topic that I believe needs to be discussed more often. And you've certainly given us a lot to think about. And I'm so grateful that you're out there doing this work. So thank you so much for sharing all of this wisdom with us.
Oh, my pleasure, Jen. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Yes. And as we wrap up, where can people find you out on the internet? Where would you like to direct folks?
Oh, okay. You can find me in several places. LinkedIn, of course, you can find me under Vicki Bradley, or you can also find me under Will Empowered. That's 1L, Women in Leadership Empowered. I'm highly active on LinkedIn. So reach out if you have questions about the conversation from today. You can also find me on Instagram at Will Empowered. Or you can go to our website. We have great resources on our website. It gives you a whole spectrum of all the different offerings that we provide. And it's really about, helping leaders to excel as conscious leaders. And also, just how do you start to include your peers, have peer-to-peer mentoring, networking, all of the things that are super important to build our power skills.
Excellent.
So those are ways you can find me.
Sounds like so many good resources out there. And I have to mention, Vicki also has a podcast, Women in Leadership Talk, that I highly recommend you check out as well. And I have to share that Vicki has a new on-demand networking course. So that can also be found on her website. And I know for job seekers, networking is something that is very difficult, but can really propel us forward in our careers. So this is it sounds like a self-paced course that includes a live Q&A session on a monthly basis to enhance skills and practice and, build your network and expand your skills. So I definitely recommend that folks check that out as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. Appreciate that.
Yes, of course. So that's a wrap for today. As always, you can find the detailed show notes on the blog at flourish.careers/blog. I'll talk to you next time.